All right, it's time for Chapter 4 key questions, starting with describe life in the Chesapeake colonies in the 1600s. As I joked in class, it was not very good. Very rough. Lifespan was very short. About half of the people died, people who were born there, about half of them died before the age of 20. Diseases were rampant. Men far outnumbered women, meaning there were very few marriages and stable families. Marriages that did occur were often torn apart by the death of a spouse. So that's one of the first many differences. It was a very agricultural based economy as well. Speaking of which, number two, how did the Chesapeake colonies recruit enough workers for the tobacco economy? How did they treat those workers? Well, by number one, you could guess that they had to bring in more people in order to keep the labor force large enough to keep the tobacco economy growing. And they came at the beginning mostly in the form of indentured servants. Indentured servants would come over here. They would sign a contract to work for 7 to 10 years. After that time period, they were supposed to be able to gain some land, but one major reason why so many are brought over here is because of something called the headright system. Plantation owners, those who already had the money, were able to pay for a servant's passage across the ocean to work in the New World. And for every indentured servant they brought over, they received 50 acres. So those who already had money and wealth were able to get even more land to keep growing their wealth, creating a kind of hierarchical structure there, which we'll get to later. How did they treat those workers? Well, many times indentured servants were actually treated worse than slaves, given the worst jobs. Their indenture could be extended if they broke any rules, laws, or tried to run away, or weren't doing their job well enough. So they weren't treated very well, and how we tend to picture slaves being treated is how indentured servants were treated for their time in the New World. With that said, what caused Bacon's rebellion? Well, they had all these promises for the indentured servants. The promises that they would be granted land, and many of them did not receive that land. And so they were forced to kind of eke out an existence on the frontier. Not to mention those who did receive land received it further inland, further on the frontier, which put them into conflict with the Native American tribes. With that said, you have conflict grow between those two sides. And what does the government do about it? Governor Berkeley is accused of not only keeping the money that is collected through taxes for him and his friends, but he's also accused of building friendships and a trade partnership with those same Indian tribes who are attacking the frontiersmen. So a guy named Nathaniel Bacon comes along, and he had some money, lived on the frontier, but he's able to rally the indentured servants and the poor landless whites, and they rise up and they attack Jamestown, and they cause some major havoc. After Bacon's death, what effects did this have on the colonies? Well, the primary thing is that the southern colonies stopped depending on indentured servitude for their labor and instead relied upon slave labor. You can see beginning in 1676 and onward, you see a complete change as indentured servitude drops, the number immigrating over drops as far as white indentured servants, and the number of slaves increases dramatically. Which brings us to number four. How did slavery change in the late 1600s? Initially, slaves were treated like normal people. They were similar to indentured servants. Many of them could earn their freedom, and while many were lifelong servants as well because they had been purchased, many were able to either earn their freedom or over time gain their freedom. Sorry, I kind of ranted there. So, how did it change over time? Well, as more laws are being brought over from Barbados and the Barbados slave codes go into effect, it begins to turn into a lifelong servitude. I talked about the word chattel slavery. Chattel means that they were property. They passed laws that say that they are, in fact, property. They passed the laws that say that they can beat their slaves. The slaves don't get trials like regular citizens do. They can kill their slaves without recompense or consequence. They can convert their slaves without worrying about that, meaning that they should be granted freedom at any point. And so slavery changes from kind of an indentured servitude or extended indentured servitude into what we consider it, where they are property. The slave owners can do as they please with them. Um, and, well, they just kind of suffer. We talked about some slave rebellions as well. Um, all those slave rebellions, especially the Stoner Rebellion, simply fail to free the slaves who are involved, and instead it ends with further restrictions on their life there as slaves. Changing gears, when we talk about New England, you should always think about how it compares to the southern colonies. So how did the life expectancy compare? Well, in New England, you actually gain 10 years in your life by living in those colonies, as opposed to your life being cut short dramatically. You also have major economic differences. Due to the rocky soil and harsh environment and harsh weather of the New England colonies, they did not focus on agriculture. Instead, they were subsistence agriculture. Where they made their money was through shipping, and they shipped the natural resources they had around them, including fish, lumber, molasses. So they had a completely different economy compared to that of the southern colonies. What about women? Women in the South, after a man died, had property rights. While they weren't necessarily treated as equal, they certainly had at least some rights. Whereas in New England, once a woman was married, she legally disappeared. Everything she owned was her husband's. She had no right to vote. If she was beaten, as we went over in class, then she would be able to, if she was close to death, finally get the authorities involved. She could be forced to live back with a husband that she wasn't happy with, because divorce was frowned upon, as was separation. And women, especially in New England, gave birth to a lot of children, an average of 10 in their lifespan, with 8 children growing up. Compare that to the South, where there were very few marriages and very few stable families. That just didn't happen. Then finally, societal differences. We talked about education being one major defining difference between the two. New England, with education, they wanted their children to be able to read the Bible and to become good Christians, whereas in the South, as farmers, education just wasn't as important. You also have in the South, you have isolated communities because farms were spread out and on the frontier, whereas in New England, it was very family focused. They built and planned their cities. Every city was based around a congregation where they all came to worship. Everyone was willing to give up their money to fund that church and to fund the colony as a whole. And so they have a very tight-knit, community-driven, and religiously based culture there in New England. Two very different societies. So what was the purpose of the halfway covenant? Well, over time, people lose their zeal and their passion for the Lord, I guess you could say. And so fewer and fewer people are focused on going to church. We talked about how hard it was to become a church member, that you had to be a visible saint. And so the church leaders realize that that is an issue. And so they try to find a way in which more people can join the church. At first, it is the halfway covenant, which the idea was if you were a baptized child of a visible saint, you didn't have to have that experience yourself, but you could be a church member because you were their child and had been baptized into the church. Over time, they sacrificed more and more of those strict religious rules in order to get a wider participation and a bigger membership, because they had been fearful of losing all of the people over time. So the halfway covenant was meant to bring more people back to the church, as they had kind of lost sight of Jesus, I guess you could say. So what caused the Salem witch trials? Number 8. Well, witchcraft persecutions were something that happened a lot back in Europe, but you don't see as many hysterical moments here in America, which is probably why Salem witch trials get such large attention. Well, what caused it is a mix of things. Most would argue that it was simply the repression of many basic instincts of humankind, especially that of young adolescent females. We got into details in class. You have sexual repression and other just things that humans want to do that seem fun, that are restricted as members of the church. With that said, you also have the frightful nightmares caused by Indian raids on the frontier. Remember, this isn't too long after King Philip's War. Those young women had memories of being moved around. There's also a lot of immigration going on, well, internal immigration, not from other countries. Other reasons could be, simply the widening social stratification, as I put it in class. You have rising consumerism, people leaving the church behind. Many different causes are thrown out there, but usually they focus on the repression of those basic instincts and the Indian wars causing the fears. I do want to touch on the fact that the people who were most commonly persecuted were older women who did not have a family. And so you see them almost not maybe picking on, per se, women who were unmarried, but rather people who did not fit in the typical societal role. Finally, getting on to class warfare. How did the class system function differently in the colonies compared to Europe? Many high class individuals, or the upper level, upper crust, if you will, tried to create a class system that had been established in Europe. They tried to create it over here. You think about Lord Baltimore, the 8 Lord Proprietors, but everywhere they went, they were kind of pushed back against in America. Most people in America came for freedom, for second opportunities, and they weren't just going to answer to those over them because of that. A great example of pushing back against wealthy merchants and those at the top of society is Leisler's rebellion in New York. While he fails, it still shows a resistance. And combining that with Bacon's rebellion and future events we'll talk about, like Shays' rebellion and Whiskey Rebellion, you see the class system just overall rejected by the majority of Americans. There are exceptions. Plantation owners in the South effectively run Southern colonies, but you see pushback all across the colonial era and into even the modern era. Anyway, thanks for listening. I hope these help you on the quiz. And if you have any questions, once again, just shoot me a message on Remind or by email, or just, talk to me. It's pretty simple. All right. Have a great night.